Few things terrify us as much as the sight of a solitary fin slicing through the waves of the open ocean. But there are a few misconceptions about that. Do you know what is more likely to send you to the hospital with a bite than a shark? Turn to the left. That person sitting right there. Well, it's true. It's factual. Last year, the number of people who were sent to a hospital in New York City alone because they were bitten by another person, 1,587. Number of fatalities by a shark bite worldwide, 5. You know what's far more likely to kill you than a shark? Well, this. A coconut. 150 deaths by coconut last year alone. So if you happen to find yourself sitting on a beach in a tropical island, remember the greatest danger isn't the shark swimming out in the water, it's the coconut up in the tree. Before you lay out your blanket, look up. All right, well, we're teaching through the biblical book of 1 Kings, and today we get to chapter 17. Now, one warning about this isn't one of those passages where God's saying, rah, rah, way to go. And maybe you're thinking, yeah, isn't that the way it was with the last chapter and the chapter before that? Is Mike just grumpy? Well, no. We're committed to teaching through the Bible and the books of the Bible. And one of the things that we're discovering in this book of 1 Kings is God isn't going up to these kings and these leaders and these people saying, you guys are doing a really great job. Nux. It's not that. Rather, he's saying, you're missing it. You're off. Straighten up. So, that's what we're getting at. Chapter 17. Ready for it? Starts with this, verse 1. Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. Is that a happy message? No. After delivering a hard message like this to King Ahab, Elijah, he doesn't stick around to meet the wife and kids. He gets out of there. God told him to go here. Verse 5. So he did what the Lord had told him. He went to the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan and stayed there. God provided birds to bring him food and provided a brook to supply him with water even during this drought. But, verse 7, sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. And it wasn't just Elijah that suffered from this drought. Many of the people living in Israel, well, they were suffering. Chapter goes on and gives us a story about a widow. When Elijah asked her for food, she replied saying this, verse 12, I don't have any bread. Only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son that we may eat it and die. Well, bummer. The story of the widow and her son is actually a pretty amazing story about faithfulness, about faith, about provision. I'd encourage you to read it. We're going to stick with the storyline of the King Ahab. So here's what we've got. We've got a drought. We've got a dry brook. We've got empty cupboards. And maybe you hear those and think, I can relate to that. Maybe your life today, you're realizing, I know that Thanksgiving is coming up and we're close to the holiday seasons, but the reality is my life isn't the way I want it to be. It hurts. There's pain. I'm just hoping for the day when this hurt and pain goes away. But the brook, my brook is dry. Verse 7. Sometime later, the brook, it dried up because there had been no rain in the land. The setting. Dry brooks, empty cupboards. Ahab was the king of Israel. This was his land. These were his people. So what is the king going to do? What's he going to do about it? Well, he did something along the lines of this. It's a vending machine. 13 deaths by vending machine last year. You believe that? 13. You know, statistically speaking, vending machines are more lethal than sharks. Personally, I'd rather take my chances with a vending machine. But how does it happen? How can a vending machine be dangerous? Here, one report says this: Kevin tilted the machine. No can came out. He tilted it again, still nothing. Kevin continued to move the machine forcefully. The machine fell on Kevin. Still no can came out. I don't know if they needed that last line, but it's in there. You know what that is? That's a part of litigation. It's part of a litigation report because what happened, Kevin died from the vending machine falling on him. His parents, they decided to sue the vendor. They claimed that the vending machine didn't have a sticker warning about the dangers of rocking the machine while attempting to steal a soda. Their belief: well, it's not Kevin's fault. It's the vending machine. Yes, Kevin was trying to thieve a soda, but he's still the victim. Verse 1, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next years except at my word. Well, that happened. Those words were fulfilled. When they were, how do you think the king Ahab responded? Chapter 18, verse 17. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" He blamed the vending machine. He said, "Elijah, it's you. Elijah, it's you. This is because of you. You're the problem. You're the reason we're having these issues. It's your fault." Blame. That's what's going on in 1 Kings chapter 17. And I'm going to guess this isn't just Elijah. We've become pretty good at this. Well, it's not my fault. Don't blame me. There wasn't a warning label. No one told me. It's okay for me to behave the way that I behave. It's okay for me to do what I do. If you came from the situation that I came from, if you experienced what I experienced, if you lived with the hurt that I live with, you'd be doing the same thing that I do. Don't blame me. It's not me. It's not my fault. Does anybody else have those tendencies? I do. When something goes wrong, my default is to look for someone or something to blame. Well, my spouse doesn't communicate. Well, my kids don't listen. The teacher just expects too much. The politicians, they're ruining the country. The ref blew the call. God didn't act. That's what's happening here in chapter 17. 3 years earlier, King Ahab was very clearly and very specifically warned, if you continue on the path you're on, if you continue to do what you are doing your own thing and ignoring the way of the Lord, there's not going to be any rain. But when that was fulfilled, when there wasn't any rain, when the brooks are dry and the cupboards are empty, Ahab, he doesn't accept any responsibility for this. Rather, he blames Elijah. He sends people all out search to try and find Elijah. One of his men finds Elijah, and here's what he says to Elijah. He says, "As surely as the Lord your God lives, there is not a nation or kingdom where my master," that's King Ahab, "has not sent someone to look for you. And whenever a nation or kingdom claimed you were not there, he made them swear they could not find you." See, King Ahab, he nowhere in here is he asking, well, what's my role? There's some issues, there's some problems going on in my land and in my nation. How am I contributing to this? How am I a part of the problem? He didn't do any of that. Rather, he did the easier thing. He just blamed Elijah. Focused all his energy on trying to take Elijah out. He didn't blame the thief. He blamed the vending machine. And I don't think he's alone. We can say things like, well, yeah, I know I'm having some relational challenges, but the reality is I'm not a great communicator. It's not natural for me to directly communicate and to share my feelings, but it's not my fault. That was never modeled for me. Or I'm really troubled. I'm not liking my job. Things at work aren't going well, but it's not my fault. The people I work with, they're difficult. Why do we have a tendency to do that? Why do we, like King Ahab, if we identify with him for a few moments, why do we have such a difficult time taking responsibility for our own actions? Why do we have this tendency to constantly look for someone or something else to blame? Verse 17, when he saw Elijah, he said to them, "Is that you troubler of Israel?" He says, Elijah, we know Elijah's not the problem, but the king, he can't see that he is part of it. He can't see that a lot of the responsibility is his. And when it's us, when we're the ones in the situation, it can be challenging to see. I want to share an example of this to you that I received a while back. I'm going to share with you just an excerpt from an email message that I got. And don't try and figure out, who is that? The person's not, they relocated, they're not here anymore. I changed it enough to try and protect the person's identity. But listen to what's going on underneath this. She wrote, "Joe and I have been in a relationship for almost a year. It was going really well until I became pregnant. That freaked him out and he left. I don't know what to do. I'm devastated and mad at God. Why did God allow this to happen to me?" When I got this, I'll tell you, that's a hard message to hear. I don't desire that for anyone. And I imagine that it was even harder to live out. I mean, she was hurting and she was heartbroken. But when we're objective and when we're not in that moment, can't we look at that and say, is it really fair to blame God for that? I mean, isn't God pretty clear about guidelines for things like how to handle our sexuality? See, sometimes the mess, or at least a part of the mess, is really our own making. Rather than blaming God, there are times when we really should be confessing to God. Verse 17, when he saw Elijah, he said to them, "Is that you troubler of Israel?" Elijah was the man of God. Elijah was the spiritual leader. Ahab, he blamed the vending machine. And I know that can be a little countercultural. It can be non-PC, a complex subject, but somewhere along the lines, the Bible teaches that you and I, we do have a choice. We do have some personal responsibility. Don't get me wrong. Don't take this the wrong way. We don't have a responsibility for everything that happens to us. I get that. Victims of abuse aren't responsible for being abused. No one deserves that. Victims of cancer don't have responsibility for getting cancer. There are things that are beyond our control. We don't have a responsible for everything that happens to us, but we do have a responsibility for how we respond. We may have been dealt a bad hand, but we still choose how we're going to play the cards. At some point, to some degree or another, we are still responsible for playing the hand that we have been dealt. Often, like this, Like King Ahab, our initial impulse is to justify. Our initial impulse is to pass the blame. That goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. That goes all the way back to Adam and to Eve. Us? Well, fruit, tree? Who? Us? No, it was Eve. She's the one who did it. We have those tendencies. What can happen for you and for I is to come to think of ourselves as victims rather than sinners. Read this with me. It's from 1 John 1, verse 8. Join me. If we claim to be without sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. King Ahab, well, he blamed Elijah for the problem. But God points the finger in the opposite direction. Verse 18, I have not made trouble for Israel, Elijah replied, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. This is happening, Elijah's saying, this is happening because of you, Ahab. God is removing his blessing from you because you have broken his commandments. God has created this world in a certain way with a certain order. And when we choose to live and to step outside of that created order, consequences, they're eventually going to catch up. Here's what we know about King Ahab. Chapter 16 tells us this, verse 31. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonites, and he began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal, and he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole and did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the kings of Israel before him. Ahab, he was living the way that he wanted to live. He was doing what he felt like doing. He wasn't following the way of the Lord. Remember how this series started? We looked at a passage in Deuteronomy where God laid out just four guidelines for the kings. He said, I got these 4 things for you. Any idea how many of those Ahab was following? None. 0. He was blowing them all off. He wasn't using the influence that God has given him to serve people. He was using his influence to serve himself. He was blatantly blowing off the teachings of the Bible and not taking any personal responsibility for the problems that came with that. He said, it's Elijah. It's my spouse, it's my coworker, it's my kid, it's my parent, it's my teacher, it's my teammate, it's my coach. It's the vending machine. What drought are you facing today? What problem are you wrestling with? Don't take this the wrong way. We do live in a broken and a sin-filled world, so there are many things that happen that aren't on us. Don't blame yourself for every hurt and pain in life. I mean, look at Jesus. Jesus didn't get nailed to the cross because of his bad. Many of the problems in life, well, they aren't on us. But a few of them are. And what God is saying in 1 Kings chapter 17 is that our first stop when it comes to determining responsibility, our first stop should be with me. We should ask ourselves questions such as, how about me? I may not like this situation. I may not like what's happening right now, but what's my role in this? What's my part in this? Am I contributing to this problem? Even if 99% of it is something else, even if 99% can be attributed to someone else, we should still be asking, well, what's my 1%? What can I learn from this? What can I do different. For the followers of Jesus, assessing my role in our challenges, in our problems in life, that doesn't have to be a liability, and it doesn't have to be a guilt trip. It can be a great tool for spiritual growth and for acquiring wisdom. So why is it that we have a tendency to avoid owning mistakes and acknowledging our part? I'll tell you what I think it is. I think that there's something inside of us that's inclined to get justification, to get it backwards. When I do something wrong, when I take my way instead of God's way, like Ahab, there's a part of us that believes, well, I can be justified if I can just find a reason. I can be justified for that if I can just come up with an explanation. I can be justified for doing that if I can just find an excuse for what I did. We look for someone or something else to blame to clear ourselves. Do you realize the way and the teaching of Jesus is different? Opposite. Counterintuitive. 1 John 1, 8 and 9. If we claim to be without sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. Read the rest of it with me. If we confess our sins, He is faithful and just and will forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness. And you may have heard that verse before. There's a reason for that. That is at the heart, that is at the soul, that is at the center of the Christian faith. Do you get that? Do you live that? It's saying, it isn't some creative excuse that I can come up with before the sin that justifies me, but rather it's the forgiveness of Jesus after it. It's not the way that I can find an explanation before the act that justifies me, but rather it's the forgiveness of Jesus that comes after it. We aren't vindicated. The way of Jesus, the way that He shows us in the Bible, our vindication, it doesn't come because we can find an excuse or a reason or an explanation or a scapegoat. We're not cleared because of anything before the action, but by the love and the mercy of Jesus that comes after it. And there is a word that we use to describe this. Grace. It's grace. 1 Kings chapter 17, Ahab blamed Elijah. Kevin's parents blamed the vending machine. And God is saying, don't let that be you. Don't live your life finding ways to duck personal responsibility. That will never lead to healing. That will never lead to wholeness. That will never lead to wisdom. As followers of Jesus, we don't have to excuse it. We don't have to fake it. We don't have to blame it. We don't have to cover it up. We don't have to live with the guilt. Don't get justification backward. There is a better way. We aren't saved by an excuse that we can come up with that happened before the act. We are saved by the forgiveness, by the love, by the grace of God after it.